This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Leaders sign final communique as the G7 summit draws to an end. South Africa's Ramaphosa praises G7 leaders for agreeing to negotiate on COVID-19 vaccine intellectual property rights. And the World Health Organization marks the World Blood Donor Day by honoring blood donors. Welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. Also ahead on the program. In business, South Africa's consumer food price inflation likely to average 5.5% in the second quarter. And in sports, we take you to Tanzania, where the country's record-breaking mountain climber Rawan Dakik is scaling new heights. Let's start in the UK, where the three-day G7 summit has drawn to a close and leaders signed the final communique. CGTN's Nawid Jabakil wraps up the highlights of this year's summit from Cornwall on England's southwest coast.
This G7 summit was a chance to shore up strained relationships that have been so crucial to global power in recent decades. In a final communique signed by the leaders, they pledged to offer 1 billion vaccines to poorer nations to fight COVID-19. The World Health Organization and the UN welcomed the move, but said wealthy nations should share the production of vaccinations as well. On climate change, there was a pledge to honor existing commitments to offer $100 billion a year to help tackle the effects of global warming on low and middle income countries. Many of the G7 states have fallen short of that target in recent years. But this event was also a chance to put on a united front against the foreign policy challenges facing the group. And in its agreement, it's called for the World Health Organization to be given transparent and independent access to China for a phase 2 investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. Beijing has previously insisted it has and will cooperate with the organization, and that any studies should be carried out through the right channels. There was also a mention of Hong Kong's future and alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang, particularly around forced labor. Beijing has strongly denied those allegations. Focusing on the developing world, US President Joe Biden unveiled a global infrastructure plan to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative. And on the whole, the G7 was clearly looking to make a statement here after no mention of the Asian country in last year's communique. Despite the tougher rhetoric, though, there was also a realization that many global challenges would require cooperation.
So I think you're going to see just straightforward dealing with China. And again, we're not looking, as I've told Xi Jinping myself, I'm not looking for conflict. Where we can cooperate, we'll cooperate. Where we disagree, I'm going to state it frankly, and we are going to respond to actions that are inconsistent.
President Biden and the First Lady finished off their UK tour with a tea with the Queen at Windsor Castle. From here, most of the G7 leaders head to Brussels for a NATO summit. And after that, President Biden sits down with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Geneva on Wednesday, with bilateral relations near an all-time low. Nawid Jabakil, CGTN, St. Ives.
Meanwhile, this year's G7 summit communique has touched upon several issues concerning China, to which a spokesperson from the Chinese embassy in the UK replied. Our reporter Cui Huiyao in Beijing has the details.
The Chinese embassy in the UK responded to some major allegations on China made by the G7 communique. First, Beijing criticized the G7 leaders' call for a review of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Chinese embassy statement pointed out that politicians in the United States and certain countries ignored facts and science and negated the conclusions of the WHO experts group report earlier this year. It says those accusations against China are unreasonable and are political manipulation. Forward, Beijing says it is willing to continue cooperation with the international community, but says origin tracing should be conducted from a global perspective, meaning not just focusing on China alone. And on China's human rights conditions, earlier White House officials said the U.S. President Joe Biden wanted the G7 leaders to speak in a single voice against China's labor practices in Xinjiang. And now the Chinese embassy in the UK said the G7 communique distorted the facts and deliberately slandered China and interfered in China's internal affairs. And with regard to the rule-based international system, China has reiterated that there's only one set of rules and there's only one system, that the rules are set by majority, not the minority. It said world affairs should be handled through consultation by all countries, and global decisions cannot be dictated by a small group of countries anymore.
It is widely known that Africa is endowed with vast resources. The struggle for control of these resources has raged on since the colonial times and continues to this day. The West has been on the spot for invading poor nations to access their natural resources, but there's little evidence of the West's attempt to develop the continent. For instance, recently it emerged that the UK aid to African countries could be cut by up to 66%. Wilkista Nyabwa reports.
On Saturday, leaders of the G7 countries, some of the world's largest economies, unveiled an infrastructure plan for the developing world. The G7 partnership, dubbed Build Back Better World, aims to finance development projects in developing countries, Africa included. But though the promises sound promising, they are prefaced by a history of the West's scramble for control of Africa's resources, which has often left the continent disenfranchised. The struggle for control over Africa's natural resources has raged since the colonization of the continent. South Africa's potential mineral wealth, for example, is estimated to be around $2.5 trillion, while the mineral reserves of the Democratic Republic of Congo are thought to be worth $24 trillion. The onset of colonialism saw African economies destroyed and fragmented. African countries became providers of raw materials such as unprocessed minerals, timber and agricultural products for the development of other countries. It continues today as the forces that undermine Africa shift from the former colonizers to Western transnational corporations. A 2017 report by a coalition of UK and African equality and development campaigners, including Global Justice Now, found that more wealth leaves Africa every year than enters it. The key factors contributing to this inequality include unjust debt payments and multinational companies hiding proceeds through tax avoidance and corruption. The report argued that the prevailing narrative, where rich country governments say their foreign aid is helping Africa, is a distraction and misleading. It has further emerged that UK aid to individual African countries is being cut by 66% this year. And as the G7 countries mull over the infrastructure project, some experts say transforming aid into a process that genuinely benefits the continent could be more beneficial. And now back to you.
Well, some analysts say that a reduction of aid to Africa, as well as competition for a slice of its wealth, could have an impact on the continent's least developed economies. To unpack this further, earlier we spoke with Menzi Ndlovu, a senior political and risk analyst based in South Africa.
We have seen Western funding and funding from Western government or multilateral institutions being attached to conditionalities that are not necessarily aligned to political and cultural norms in specific developing and African settings. Historically, what has been of contention or particularly problematic were structural adjustment requirements that were attached to loans from institutions like the IMF, which typically required some wide sweeping political changes. But fortunately, we are seeing a bit of a normative shift when it comes to Western aid. And I think that comes from the realization that these demands or extensive demands are no longer as viable in this new context where African governments are becoming more assertive. So what we are seeing now is greater consideration of the local context. We are seeing less assertiveness for certain kinds of political changes and cultural changes. And we are also seeing greater engagement with local stakeholders, which I think is leading to a particular shift when it comes to Western funding and making it more aligned with the countries that they intend to assist. And hopefully we can see fewer contentions in the future due to this more considered approach. When it comes to the balance in agreements between African states and multinational companies and the relationships thereof, historically, there are, as you alluded to, many instances in which these deals were skewed, very largely in part because of power dynamics and unbalanced power dynamics. But I think at the same time, we must recognize African governments as agencies in some of these dealings. Firstly, in many instances, the regulatory environment in many African states has been uncertain and characterized by loopholes that were then exploited by some entrants. And also we need to recognize that a lot of these statesmen that are now crying foul were involved in the cementing of some of these deals. And quite frankly, they didn't bargain properly. I think we need to recognize that our strength is as a collective, all right? We are stronger when we are together. And it's important that as a bloc, as African states, we need to come together when negotiating deals with large players, as opposed to attempting to gazumping each other. And in doing so, we can strengthen our bargaining power as a bloc.
While European countries at the G7 summit agreed to enter text-based negotiations in the WTO on a waiver of COVID-19 vaccine intellectual property rights, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has applauded the decision and says it is a move in the right direction. Nokutula Shabalala has more.
In October 2020, South Africa and India made a very broad proposal. They have been calling on members of the World Trade Organization to suspend, for a limited time, intellectual property protection rights for COVID-19 vaccines. Driven by the fear that developing countries will bear the brunt of the pandemic, the proposal seeks to attain rapid access to affordable COVID-19 diagnostics and treatment. In May, the US backed the move, but some European leaders have been pushing against the idea. Instead, they have been proposing alternatives, which they say won't harm the production of the vaccine. India and South Africa, both guests at the G7 summit over the weekend, are still leading forward with their proposal.
We believe that there is a need for solidarity to be pledged, that your G7 countries and indeed the G20 countries need to pledge solidarity with those that have been more negatively affected by the pandemic.
Leaders at the summit agreed to open up negotiations to firm up and fine-tune the text in the World Trade Organization on the waiver of the COVID-19 vaccine intellectual property rights.
What we have been able to get from, say, the European countries is the agreement that the World Trade Organization process must ensue, and there must be negotiations that are based on the text. And we'd like to believe that, having encountered negativity and opposition right at the beginning, the position has softened, it has become much more reasonable, and for them to have agreed that we should now have text-based negotiations, it represents a move which we would like to acknowledge. And when we do get to text-based negotiations, we believe that we can make headway.
South Africa has the highest infection numbers of the COVID-19 virus in Africa. The country is now amid a third wave of the pandemic and will require more vaccines. G7 leaders agreed to donate 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses over the next year to poorer countries, of which South Africa will be one of them. The Southern African country has called for the expansion of the global lenders' emergency reserves to vulnerable countries.
And we know that there's $650 billion that has been talked of and has been more or less agreed. And we also want access to that so that your G7 countries and your more developed economies should donate the rights that they have and have them allocated to countries that do not have those rights. Now, there's talk of making $100 billion available. Initially, it was said to be $33 billion, and we've argued that it should be increased. We are still aiming for at least 25%, which could be in the range of $162 billion.
The move, supported by G7 countries, will fill the funding gap needed by developing countries in efforts to recover their economies and health systems post-COVID-19. Nokuthula Shabalala, CGTN.
Well, let's broaden this discussion further. I'm joined by Professor Jeffrey Mfalele. He's the Vice President for Research at the South African Medical Research Council in Pretoria. Professor Mfalele, thank you for joining us. Even with the rich countries appearing to soften their position on patent waivers of the COVID-19 vaccines, it is still not an immediate solution for Africa. How is Africa addressing its vaccine shortfall?
Thanks for having me. So it's true that is not an immediate solution because if you look at the numbers alone in terms of the need for vaccines, Africa set the target of vaccinating at least 10% of its population by September 2021. And this required at least 225 million doses of the vaccines. And as we speak, only 32 million doses have been used. And this translates to, 9.4 million people fully vaccinated, and the rest just received one dose of the vaccine. So clearly, to address the short-term needs in terms of the vaccines, I think Africa should seize every opportunity. What we have seen at G7 over the weekend, we need to see more of those actions where rich countries are able to donate vaccines to poorer countries, not just Africa, but obviously other developing nations. We also want to see more bilateral negotiations with any country that is able to manufacture vaccines, because we need to have vaccines as soon as possible. So that will be the short term. The likes of China, which have got 2 vaccines already approved for emergency use by the World Health Organization, Sinovac and Sinopharm. These vaccines are there to expand the pool available. So in addition to contribution to COVAX facility, I think African countries can engage in bilateral discussions with countries like China, Russia, and any other country that is able to bring the vaccines to the market as soon as possible. So those are some of the things that Africa can do.
All right, yeah, but let's talk a bit about the rising number of cases on the continent. How can African countries, though, deal with the rising numbers of cases and deaths on the continent?
Yeah, so that one requires a different approach because you need to cap the number of rising cases. And you can do it by vaccination, but obviously vaccination will be like a medium-term solution in this case. And I think that we should not really forget the use of the basics, the non-pharmaceutical intervention, social distancing and things like that. So these are the basics that we have at our disposal, and we should encourage to use them because if we don't, people will think that they don't work, and the only thing that works is the vaccine. And we also know that even with the vaccine, there is a possibility that you can get infected despite getting vaccinated. The only thing is that if you are vaccinated, the outcome of infection or breakthrough infection is supposed to be very mild or moderate. We don't expect people who are vaccinated after infection to end up in the hospital or to die from infection, even though there might be a few of these cases. And then the most important thing is really to now take advantage of our manufacturing capacity, because we have been talking about rich countries waiving IP and also sharing the know-how and the recipe of making the vaccines. But clearly, we're not going to see this in the next 3 to 6 months. They will take time, and this will be a medium-term solution Africa should look into to make sure that if we have got another pandemic, we are able to have our own manufacturing capacity and we can respond to the pandemic.
All right, Professor Jeffrey Mfalale joining us there from Pretoria. Thank you. Well, meanwhile, though, South African authorities have announced that they will not release 2 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. The South African Health Products Regulatory Authority made the decision after reviewing data provided by the U.S. FDA. The U.S. regulatory agency has declared that batches produced at a Baltimore factory were unsuitable. This could hamper the government's vaccine rollout. The country began phase 2 of its COVID-19 immunization drive in May. It had ordered 4.5 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, in addition to the 2 million Johnson & Johnson vaccine doses. Well, let's cross over to CGTN's Angelo Coppola. He's joining us with more from Johannesburg. Angelo, what more can you tell us about that suspension of the 2 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Well, Beatrice, essentially it means that the batch has been waiting for clearance in the Eastern Cape will now have to be destroyed. We don't know how it's going to be destroyed. We do know it is going to be destroyed. Aspen hasn't made any official statements yet in terms of any new delivery dates, but it has been described as a significant setback for South Africa. Speaking during his feedback after the G7 summit on Sunday, President Cyril Ramaphosa says that the Aspen CEO has assured him that the producer, that's Aspen, would begin working on the vaccine this week. We didn't get any other detail in terms of delivery dates, but there's no doubt that the Aspen team are scrambling, Beatrice.
Well, Angelo, so just give us a little bit of a brief on this. How much is this a setback for South Africa, and what is the current status of South Africa's COVID-19 inoculation program?
Well, look, the program has been slow to get off the ground anyway. There haven't been enough vaccines available locally because they're on order or on back order. And that's before the J&J issue of those 2 million vaccines that have been removed from the system. The healthcare workers, of course, are still being vaccinated locally. And over 1 million 60-year-olds and older than that have also been vaccinated. And that's out of a total of 5 million people. We do know that the other vaccines are being delivered according to plan, but aren't anywhere near enough to keep all the vaccine sites occupied and busy. This is likely to delay the rollout for the next phases that come after that. But no one can provide any further detail in this regard at this stage. But it's no good news at any stretch of the imagination right now, Beatrice.
Well, Angelo, just how bad is the third wave, and what is the government's response?
Well, Beatrice, we are entering, in fact, we have entered the third phase in most provinces. Sunday's new cases were over 7,500 overnight. And of those, nearly 5,000 are in Gauteng province alone. That's the economic heartland of the country, as it were. There were over 650 new hospital admissions and 78 in-hospital deaths. Government, of course, did introduce some lockdown measures some 2 weeks ago, but that doesn't seem to have slowed things down. Getting back to Gauteng, though, the key concern in the province at the moment is the Charlotte Maxeke Hospital. It's still closed after that fire, and that's more than a month ago. And there's some 100 isolation beds that haven't been available for authorities to use just yet. There's also no clarity about when that hospital is going to be reopened. So the race is on to get the Charlotte Maxeke Hospital up and running, and also remembering we're entering the winter season when flu does increase, and that's going to be a problem as well. Beatrice?
All right, Angelo Coppola joining us there from Johannesburg. Today is June the 14th. marking the World Blood Donor Day. The day has been set aside to raise awareness about safe blood and blood products for transfusion. It is marked by the World Health Organization as well as the global health community. This year's slogan, "Give blood and keep the world beating," looks to honor those who donate blood. This year's campaign also looks to encourage the youth to donate blood. The World Blood Donor Day comes as the coronavirus pandemic continues to challenge healthcare systems around the world. Well, let's cross over to CGTN's Michael Baleke. He's in Kampala for us with more on the World Blood Donor Day. Michael, Uganda is one of the countries that has seen a sharp decline in the donation of blood. What would you say has led to this situation?
Hello, Beatrice. That is true. In Uganda, of course, schools make up the biggest source of the country's blood supply. And currently, government has initiated partial lockdown of the country to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus, following a surge. Recently, we've had a surge in cases, and many of these cases are manifesting, Beatrice, in the younger population, including school children. So all schools, secondary schools, universities have been ordered to close. And because of the lockdown, starting a blood donation campaign also with people coming in doves, gathering in small spaces is not accepted at this time. And this puts many patients at risk right now because they're in need of blood and the blood is running low. Beatrice?
All right. Well, let me drop in Dr. Andre Lua. He's the Technical Officer for Blood Safety at the World Health Organization's Regional Office for Africa, and he's based in Brazzaville. Dr. Lua, thank you for joining us on the program. So why is today important, and could you give us an overview of blood donations drives in Africa?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I talk about blood donation, I would like to present our region briefly. The WHO African region covers 47 countries with almost 1 billion of inhabitants, which represent around 40% of the global population. The region is facing a high
Dr. Lua, can I just rephrase my question, because I want to hear from you about the blood safety and the World Blood Donor Day. And I'm just asking you why this day is important, and give us an overview of the actual blood donations in Africa.
Okay, the latest evaluation that we conducted in the region reported that the blood donation was 5 million, which represent 10% of the need of blood in the region.
All right, Michael, let me just come back to you so briefly. In Uganda, how has COVID-19, though, affected blood donations in Kampala?
Beatrice, the Uganda Blood Bank handles about 400,000
Dr. Lua, could you if you could just give me a minute, I'd like to listen to Michael Baleke for a moment there. Michael, how has COVID-19 blood donations been affected by COVID-19 in Kampala?
Beatrice, the blood bank here in Uganda handles about 400,000 units of blood every year, and about every blood unit needs about $40 to process it. Now, with a surge in new cases of COVID-19, now that we're in a second wave, the blood bank is running low of funds because most of these funds are being diverted to the COVID emergency programs. The blood bank has on several occasions recently run out of reagents to process the blood, and because much of the money is now diverted to handle COVID-19 emergencies, I'm talking about buying safety gear like PPE for hospitals, putting up more ICU beds recently, and medication for COVID patients. Now that Uganda is also now looking for more money for vaccines, you find that there is no there's no money. The money is not enough to fund the blood bank. And of course, the other reason is that people now, Beatrice, who were previously willing to donate blood, now fear, they kind of fear to go and be exposed to the virus while they're donating the blood. Beatrice?
All right, Michael Baleke, we'll leave it there for the moment. Joining us from Kampala, and Dr. Andre Luawa joining us from Brazzaville. To you both, thank you. You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. 3 soldiers killed in an ambush in northern Cote d'Ivoire. And Egypt hosts an exhibition dedicated to Gaza's reconstruction efforts.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis,
Syria,
Juba, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Turning to Cote d'Ivoire, at least 3 soldiers were killed while on patrol near the border with Burkina Faso. At least 4 soldiers were wounded in the attack. According to the Defense Ministry, the convoy hit an explosive before being ambushed. The ministry added that the soldiers were on a reconnaissance mission near the northeastern town of Techni. No group has claimed responsibility for that attack. On Thursday, Egypt held an exhibition dedicated to Gaza's reconstruction efforts. The Cairo Construction Hub is a 4-day event which brought together developers and politicians to discuss the most pressing needs for the Palestinians. Egyptian cabinet members also held talks with private sector representatives on the essential projects that the Gaza Strip needs. Here is Adel Mahroui with more details.
On June 4th, Egypt sent a convoy of engineering and building equipment to Gaza to prepare for the Strip's reconstruction. Cairo sent some 50 bulldozers, cranes, trucks and other construction vehicles through the Rafah passage to begin clearing the destruction debris. This week, the Egyptian capital held a construction forum aimed at including the private sector in its plans to rebuild the Palestinian Strip.
We thank the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and thank Egypt, our big sister, for this generous initiative, which is the first of its kind for Gaza's reconstruction. The Gaza Strip is in need of immediate aid in all fields, especially in infrastructure, electricity grids, water supply, roads and other vital services.
We're still waiting for details on the projects which need to be implemented in Gaza. What are their sizes? What needs to be done? Officially, that hasn't been finalized yet. Already, Egyptian companies are visiting the Strip to understand the volume of the work that needs to be done.
In May, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi pledged $500 million for Gaza's reconstruction. The initiative followed Cairo's successful ceasefire deal that ended 11 days of hostilities between Israel and the Palestinian armed resistance. Egyptian companies will lead these rebuilding projects.
Egypt has 65,000 construction-related companies. We don't need all of them to participate in reconstructing Gaza. The Gaza Strip is estimated to require some $10 billion to recover from the destruction recently inflicted. We have the details of the destruction tally.
The Cairo Construction Hub is a 4-day forum that tackled the opportunities Egypt has in rebuilding Gaza. While the Palestinian Strip was the focus this week, companies also discussed the potential they have in working in other Arab nations.
Egypt has a regional edge which makes it capable through its contracting companies to provide expertise to the region. We have the ability to help in developing neighboring countries like Libya and Syria after security stability is reached. We have already begun participating in projects in Iraq.
According to officials in Gaza, the 11 days war with Israel left nearly 20,000 buildings either completely or partially destroyed. A Palestinian cabinet delegation headed by Deputy Prime Minister Ziad Abu Amr arrived in Cairo on Sunday. Their prime task is to agree on a coordination platform between the Egyptian government and the Palestinian Authority to ensure that funds dedicated for Gaza's reconstruction are channeled properly through the Palestinian government rather than Hamas. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Israel's parliament has approved a new coalition government led by nationalist Naftali Bennett and centrist Yair Lapid. It brings an end to Benjamin Netanyahu's record 12-year rule. Bennett was sworn in as a new prime minister on Sunday. He will lead the new government, which was approved by a thin majority of 60 to 59. Under a rotating deal, Lapid will replace Bennett as prime minister in 2023. The new coalition is made up of 8 parties, including, for the first time, an Arab-led party. The new government has ended a lingering political crisis in the country, which has witnessed 4 elections in the past 2 years. CGTN Stephanie Fried has more from Tel Aviv.
This is historic, unseating the ex-prime minister at this point, Benjamin Netanyahu, who served the longest period of time as prime minister in this country, in the country's history. It was a lot of tension, a lot of work on the part of the partners who built this coalition, up to the very last seconds when the vote was happening in the Knesset or Parliament plenum. It was not certain whether they would pass through this new change coalition, but they did, and now it's time to roll up their sleeves, get to work. Naftali Bennett, who now is Israel's new prime minister, he is the country's first religious prime minister. However, for the first time in a very long time, the ultra-Orthodox or religious parties are not part of the government as well. Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting on the outside. As you can see behind me, lots and lots. We're estimating here between 10,000 to 20,000 people have shown up here at the central Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. They're celebrating, they're popping champagne. People were crying, hugging when they heard the news when the vote came in, and then when Naftali Bennett was sworn in. This represents change. Whether it will be long-lasting, shaky, that's the question going forward. That's what people are asking. But there certainly was a lot of momentum and motivation behind the formation of what was looked at as or perceived as a very unlikely coalition. Now we're going to watch things as they move forward.
Zambia marked its 45th Defense Force Day on Sunday. Zambian President Edgar Lungu was the chief guest at the commemoration of the day. He praised military personnel for their sacrifice and commitment to the country. He also pushed for continued modernization of the defense force. The commemoration ceremony included a military parade in the capital city, Lusaka. Spectators got to witness a display of the country's military equipment. Here's what some of them thought of the event.
I came here to see how the army and the police force and the material they have, the material they use, and all sorts of machines. And my experience has quite been perfect, tremendous. Yeah, I've actually experienced a lot and learned a lot.
For me, I feel it's a day that Zambians get to actually not only showcase their military abilities and capabilities, but also celebrate the defense team, be it the Zambia National Service, the Zambia Army, and the Zambia Air Force, for the peace that we have enjoyed for the past 50+ years as a country.
Let's now take a look at your business news. Here's what's ahead. South Africa's consumer food price inflation likely to average 5.5% in the second quarter. And Ethiopia earns $505 million from gold mining sector in the current fiscal year.
It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
The South African inflation outlook is benign. The expected large domestic harvest could lead to the easing of consumer food price inflation in the second quarter of this year, according to the Agricultural Business Chamber. Angelo Coppola picks up the story.
On the international front, maize prices are still being supported by demand from one geographical area.
Globally, the demand from the Far East, particularly South Korea, as well as the likes of Japan, but most fundamentally is the demand from China supporting the global maize prices, and South Africa is benefiting from those factors.
Global food inflation is relatively high currently, but South African consumers have been spared some of those hikes due to the strong currency. There's another saving grace.
With foot and mouth disease, it means some of the beef product and sheep product will stay in the South African market and flooding the market a bit. But there will be problems for consumers because I think things like milk and bread and maize and chicken will increase above the average rate of inflation and will make it tough for consumers.
The so-called food basket is a significant component in the overall inflation calculation.
Imported inflation, which contributes to the food basket, that pressure is off with the rand strength. And food inflation itself is relatively subdued.
Consumers face another challenge: administered prices for services controlled by government.
Electricity prices, water prices, the cost of utilities has really risen in South Africa, and that more than anything else is making consumers look for cheaper products on the supermarket shelf.
The outlook for inflation looks subdued at the moment.
Looking 6 months out, 12 months out, it's hard to see food inflation in and of itself constituting a major thrust to some big inflation, domestic inflation component.
South Africa's inflation rate is muted at the moment, and some of that is due to the strength of the rand. Hopefully it continues. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Ethiopia has earned about $505 million from the gold mining sector in the first 10 months of the current fiscal year. According to reports from the country's Mines and Petroleum Ministry, Ethiopia mined more than 6,700 kilograms of gold during that period. CGTN's Girum Chala has more on this from Addis Ababa.
Gold exports in Ethiopia have tremendously increased over the past year and are on course to become the single largest foreign currency earner for the nation. Over the past 10 months, Ethiopia's Ministry of Mines and Petroleum had planned to deliver 5,921 kilograms of gold to the National Bank of Ethiopia, but managed to provide 6,785 kilograms of gold, with over $504 million secured in sales. The increased activities in the mining sector has also created 93 new jobs for the citizens across the nation. Ethiopia has already established several gold trading centers as it seeks to boost its income from the mining sector and at the same time reduce fraud and other illegal mining activities. The Eastern Africa country has also undertaken a mass sensitization campaign that includes all relevant stakeholders to combat contraband mining activities. Such activities in the sector have caused Ethiopia's mining sector to poorly perform over the past years, adversely affecting revenues too. Among the mass sensitization works being done is the encouragement to bring artisan miners into the formal mining market. Ethiopia is now determined even more to elevate the mining sector and earn higher hard currency from it in the coming months. And for that, the mining sector's development has been given due attention by the government as one of the priority areas of achieving rapid development for the country. Last month, authorities revoked mining license for 27 mines that remained inactive as part of its effort to boost production, including the cancellation of 63 permits in December last year. The total mining license revoked by the Eastern African nation has now reached 90. In December last year, the government approved 10-year economic plan to increase foreign exchange earnings to $17 billion by 2030 from $265 million. Group Jala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Ghana's economy is on a steady path to recovery after taking a hit from the COVID-19 pandemic. Analysts say the rollout of vaccines could quicken growth in the economy, but a global shortage of vaccines threatens the country's full economic recovery. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Business activities at this market in Accra are back to pre-pandemic level, according to traders here. All the shops have reopened after lockdown restrictions were eased, and Ghana's economy is beginning to recover from the disruptions caused by COVID-19. But analysts say it may take years for the economy to rebound fully.
These are early days for us to say Ghana's economy has recovered. As I predicted last year, it's going to take us between 3 to 5 years. The recovery is going to take the form of a U-shape. Either than a V-shape. V-shape is normally when the economy falls, it bounces back to pre-COVID. But what we see in Ghana is that it's going to be U-shape. It's going to be gradual, and then it will pick up from where we were pre-COVID.
Last year, Ghana's economy contracted to 0.4% due to the pandemic. The World Bank has estimated the country's economy to grow by 1.4% this year.
Some sectors of Ghana's economy have been hit hard by COVID. And I can make mention of tourism. Once the inoculation goes on, the vaccination program is able to go on as effective as we wanted, then these sectors of the economy will be able to bounce back to lead to the full recovery that we want to achieve.
Ghana has so far inoculated nearly 900,000 people against COVID-19. It aims to vaccinate 20 million people by the end of the year.
But there are concerns that it may not be able to meet this target due to the global slump in supply of vaccines. Still, the government says it is working to get more vaccines under the WHO-backed COVAX Global Vaccine Sharing Initiative.
While the country rolls out its COVID-19 vaccines, experts are concerned about a threat of a third wave because many people have stopped wearing face masks and are not practicing other safety measures.
We have to balance the economic, social aspect with health. I understand that. And so the easy and the other thing had to be done one way or the other. But systems were supposed to have been in place, and that, unfortunately, are not being followed.
Analysts say the success of a vaccine rollout could help boost the economy. They want the government to step up efforts towards acquiring more COVID-19 vaccines to inoculate its people. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Well, let's now take a look at your sports news. Here's what's ahead. We will take you to Tanzania, where the country's record-breaking mountain climber Rawan Dakik is scaling new heights.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
The Tanzanian government has named mountain climber Rawan Dakik a tourism ambassador. 20-year-old Rawan is the first Tanzanian woman and the youngest African to summit Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world at 8,846.86 meters above sea level. CGTN's Daniel Kijo tells us more.
Mount Everest is the ultimate challenge for even the world's top mountain climbers, something the Tanzanian climber Rawan Dakik knew would be a life and death affair when she attempted the feat in March of 2021. After 2.5 months of huge dedication and determination, she made it to the top.